I continue, at least for the moment, to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg. James Bond comes later. But it's rare in politics that opportunities are presented like a suckling pig on a silver platter with an apple in its mouth, so readily and easily available for the waiting politicians to enjoy. It's even rarer, however, when politicians willingly turn their backs on such an opportunity and ignore the chance to improve their political fortunes. Yet this increasingly appears to be the case as the government shies away from delaying net zero commitments in order to alleviate the financial burden upon the electorate. It's important to keep the climate change, of course it is, and this must be done within reason and an appropriate tempo. Philip, now Lord Hammond, the former Chancellor, not someone I invariably agree with, calculated that reaching net zero would cost the country £1 trillion. To foist this vast cost upon the people, with those predominantly affected being on the lowest incomes, would be an unduly harsh thing to do. It's most perplexing, and even Mystic Mogg struggles to uncover the reason as to why there's so much ardour to steam ahead with these regulations against the cost and the pain. Interestingly, recent research from People Polling has revealed the depths of unpopularity of the net zero regulations. Only 16% of people support the pursuit of net zero if it means increasing the cost of living, while 54% of people would rather the government focus on the cost of living regardless of whether it comes at the expense of net zero. The political capital to be gained from putting the brakes on net zero is clearer than ever, not least after the Uxbridge by-election was won because of a rejection of ULEZ. While the Conservatives appear to trail Labour in the polls, surely there is no better time to free ourselves from the environmental orthodoxy and take this most apparent of opportunities. Well, I'm joined now by Professor of Politics at Kent University and the founder of People Polling, Matt Goodwin. Matt, thank you very much for joining me. You've done this polling. Where do people stand on the concept of net zero when it's just offered to them with no context?
Well, if you give people just a straightforward question, do you support the push for net zero, then you'll often find that a large majority of voters will say, yes, absolutely. And if you ask them, do you support the fight against climate change, more often than not, voters will say, yes, absolutely. But the key point here is when you then actually explain to voters what these policies mean for them personally in terms of the financial costs, they become much less supportive of these policies.
And how sensitive are they to cost? And has there been any change in this? Has the cost of living crisis made people more concerned about costs than they may have been a couple of years ago?
I think partly we're seeing the effects of the cost of living crisis. I think also, in my view, voters are beginning to tune into what net zero means for them. I think the ULEZ issue in London and Greater London has been very important for that reason. The fact that voters are now beginning to think about, well, hang on a minute, this is actually imposing some very real financial penalties on motorists. And so as voters begin to look at the detail of the policy, what we're finding is more voters oppose some of these policies than support, and that's especially true among Conservatives.
So how does this divide up in terms of the ULEZ support and opposition amongst different categories of voters? You've got a very helpful chart, I think.
Yeah, sure. So if you look at all voters in the country, only 32% say they support ULEZ, about 42% say they oppose, the rest are undecided. If you then ask voters, well, would you like a ULEZ in your local area, they become much more strongly opposed. So typically about two-thirds of voters will say, I don't really want to have a ULEZ in my local area. If you then drill down into the voters that are going to be key for Rishi Sunak, those 2019 Conservatives, the people who voted for Boris Johnson, who voted for this big challenge to the status quo, well, they're absolutely convinced that they don't support ULEZ, they don't want a ULEZ in their local area, and they really want the government to zoom in on prioritising the cost of living crisis, even if that undermines some of these net zero goals. So what I'm pointing to here, Jacob, is widespread opposition to these policies.
Particularly from people who used to vote Conservative. Is it still sensible for Labour and the Lib Dems to appeal to the net zero proponents, or does it also apply to their voters? Is this a more general trend?
I think it's a difficult one for people like Keir Starmer, because on the one hand, yes, Labour voters and Lib Dem voters are a bit more supportive of these policies, but on the other hand, we can see clearly in the data that it is the economically marginalised working class voters. It's the electricians, the mechanics, the white van drivers who are the most strongly opposed to these policies because they're likely to incur the financial costs of those policies. So, and I think also, just lastly, a lot of voters are looking at the net zero agenda, in my view at least, and are seeing something that they often feel is being imposed on them from above, at the expense of the views of ordinary people.
Because one group you've got who support ULEZ are the new elite. Who are the new elite? Are these the people who are imposing it from above?
Well, I would argue that middle-class professionals, graduates, living in the city, very affluent, economically secure, usually enjoying positions of influence and power.
Probably have a new car already.
And probably have a new car already, probably will not be hit by the costs relating to ULEZ, will not be suffering the costs of net zero personally, are very well insulated against some of those. And it's really that group that are the most supportive of this agenda. And it's not just on ULEZ, Jacob, it's also, if you look at issues like migration, if you look at issues around climate, if you look at issues around marriage and family, the new elite often have a very different view of these issues because they're the least likely to experience the negative effects of these policies.
And it extends beyond ULEZ. ULEZ has been the profile point, but that people expressing views on ULEZ have similar ones about boilers, about getting rid of petrol engines in cars and so on.
Well, I'm looking at this polling and I'm thinking, where are we going to be 5 to 10 years down the line? Because ULEZ is, in my mind, is the beginning of this debate. The fact that voters are tuning into this and are beginning to really get interested in this issue. What happens when we go to 15-minute cities? What happens when we go to heat pumps in homes, etc., etc.? This is the beginning of a bigger rebellion, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Matt.